Let's see here. I have played this stupid ass game for 23 hours, going on 24 hours, and I only have 11% completed. What the fuck were they thinking?
Resident Evil 6 is one of the worst video games I have ever played in my life. It is so egregiously, atrociously awful that I had to take several weeks, practically a month, probably going on 2 months, of a break from video games entirely after having forced myself to replay this piece of shit. For over 20 hours, I subjected myself to reliving this atrocity from start to finish. All 4 campaigns, Leon, Chris, Jake, and Ada. All 4, from start to finish. And I was immediately reminded of everything that is wrong with this game, and everything that was wrong with Capcom during this time. This is when Capcom just was not listening to fans, and they really didn't know exactly what their audience wanted, although it should have been obvious from the very beginning that this was a bad idea. But from the mindset of the executives and producers over there at Capcom, at the time, back in 2012, they figured, you know what, we're just going to make a game for everybody. We're going to make a game for action fans. We're going to make a game for stealth fans. We're going to make a game for horror fans. And we're going to incorporate as much into one particular title as we can. And so they just had some kind of staff meeting, I'm assuming, to where all of the developers gathered at the round table and wrote down a checklist of everything that they wanted to be in this game. And what they failed to realize is that Resident Evil is a series where you want to hold back. The more you put in there, the more stupid it becomes. And they just went way overboard with this game. This game has so many issues that for the first time ever, I decided to get a pen and physically write down all of the major problems that this game has. And I've come up with a good list of 26 different problems that this game has. And I've never had to do this before, but I felt it was absolutely necessary for discussing this particular game, because I don't want to leave anything out. I want to thoroughly go over everything that's wrong with Resident Evil 6. So, starting off, the main issue of what's wrong with Resident Evil 6 is that it's too long. It's way too long. The game has 4 campaigns. It's divided up into 4 campaigns. Once again, that's Leon, Chris, Jake, and Ada's campaign. Now, the length of these campaigns individually, they vary, but they're around 5 hours each. And so the total runtime of the game, not including any subsequent runs or anything, because you would have to be batshit to replay this piece of shit, the average runtime clocks in at just over 20 hours. Now, the thing about that is that this game shares the exact same issue that Alien Isolation had. One of the biggest problems with Alien Isolation was its length. 20 plus hours is too long for a survival horror game, a genre that's supposed to induce a lot of stress on the player, a genre that purposely limits mechanics and makes it difficult for the player to fight their way out of any given situation. 20 hours is too long for that sort of thing. It didn't work in Alien Isolation, and it doesn't work in this game. Resident Evil 6 is too fucking long. And not only is it too long, but the actual individual 4 campaigns don't actually coincide with each other too much. They do cross over here and there, but for the most part, they're entirely separate from one another. That's also another issue from a narrative perspective. That's a problem. What they should have done is just have one base campaign. And if they wanted to introduce all of these different characters, they could have found a way to do that, or at least tried. And, the story could have worked that way. Or they could have just had 2 separate campaigns. And, you have like Leon's campaign for one, and then you'll have Chris's campaign for the second one. And then, different characters such as Jake and Sherry and Ada, they could have all been incorporated in one of the 2. So they could have taken like a Resident Evil 2 approach. But they didn't do that either. Instead, they went way overboard and it seems like they just made two games and just slapped them together without really thinking of the consequences that would have came with doing that. And the game suffers for it tremendously. And speaking of narrative, that's another big problem with Resident Evil 6. The story is convoluted as hell. It's very difficult to follow, especially if you're playing the game for just the first time and you've never played Resident Evil 6 before. Even if you're a big fan of the series and you've kept up with the narrative of all the games, the timeline of this franchise, Resident Evil 6 is still way too ridiculous for the story that it's trying to tell. One of the biggest problems with the story is that there's too many characters and there's too much going on. Over in one area, you have Leon and a new character named Helena, who ironically has never been seen again in one of these games since Resident Evil 6. And then you have Chris Redfield, and he has his own agenda in the game's narrative, which involves a case of PTSD, which if you played Resident Evil 5, that entire angle really doesn't make any sense. It doesn't even begin to make any sense. It doesn't correlate whatsoever with anything that happened in the last game. So why they decided to go that route, that angle with Chris is beyond me. Then you have a new character named Jake, who is the son of the series staple villain Albert Wesker. And Jake is just a boring character. He's a mercenary who only cares about money. He's only after money. And he somehow gets tangled up with Sherry Birkin, who is the little girl from Resident Evil 2 grown up in this game. And they have their own objectives and whatnot. One of which involves running from a creature named the Ustanak, who is basically a ripoff of Nemesis from Resident Evil 3. And finally, you have Ada Wong, whom I believe is also hunting down Derek Simmons, who somehow has a fetish for Ada Wong, and he's pussy whipped and basically has created a clone out of her because he can't have the actual person. So this story just doesn't really make any sense on a multitude of different levels. There's way too much going on, and it borders on stupidity and parody too much throughout its 20-plus hour runtime, to the point where it's basically a cartoon. You can't take any of it seriously. But ironically, the story isn't even the worst part of Resident Evil 6. It's certainly one of the weakest elements in the game, and one of the reasons why I can't stand this fucking game at all. But in reality, it's the least of this game's problems. The real issue comes from the fucking gameplay. Everything about the gameplay in Resident Evil 6 is a disaster. It's so bad that you really honestly have to think about what was going on at Capcom during this game's development phase. Like, what were the game developers doing when they were actually developing this mess? Did they just go to the office and, sit in their chairs and bullshit for, an hour or two and then go take a 2-hour lunch and then come back and then work for another 2 hours before going home and then coming back the next day and doing it all over again? Because it seems that with the gameplay, the way it's presented in this, something clearly went wrong behind the scenes. The gameplay in Resident Evil 6 is so beyond broken and frustrating that, it's a miracle if anyone makes it halfway through this mess. You really have to have a high tolerance level for bad game design to enjoy something like this. There's really no defending this shit at all. Starting off with the just basic movement. The characters just, it's so sluggish to control anyone in this game. No matter what action that you're taking, just running around doesn't even feel right in this game. Everything feels automatic, like you really don't have much control over anything. It gets worse when you decide to start sprinting, because the camera will shift itself to a new position towards the ground. And you get this grandiose perspective as your character is running in place. And the comparison I draw closest to this would be Gears of War's Roadie Run, although the camera, the way it's presented in Gears of War actually does work. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the characters in that game are ducking while they're running, which also kind of makes sense given it's a shooting game and the whole point is to take cover. So even though it looks silly in Gears of War, it actually works from a gameplay perspective, whereas in Resident Evil 6, it really doesn't make any sense at all. The camera is absolute trash in this game. It's one of the reasons that this game is extremely difficult to play and very frustrating to deal with, because the camera at times, like when there's a scripted set piece that happens, or a scripted moment rather in the gameplay, the camera will focus on something that's in the background, and the game rips control from you as the player to focus on this one object or this one event that's happening somewhere in the environment, instead of what's actually going on around the character that you're controlling. And I can't fucking stand that. To make it even worse, because this is more or less an action horror game in comparison to just about every other Resident Evil game that exists, Capcom thought it would be a good idea to put in a meter, basically a combat meter, to where you press one of the trigger buttons on the controller and your character will initiate a series of hand-to-hand combat attacks. Now, not only does this look dumb as hell, and the feel of the mechanics for it is just extremely off, but you soon realize that this bar that's in your HUD is actually a stamina bar. They put a fucking stamina bar in a horror game. And perhaps this was due to the new craze of the Souls games, which were still fairly new at around the time that this game was released. Either way, whatever reasoning Capcom had for putting a stamina bar in this game, it was a terrible design choice. As soon as you run out of stamina in this fucking game, your character starts moping around, acting as if they can barely move, and they're like halfway paralyzed. They're a paraplegic from the waist down. And the reason this is a problem is because the game has actually been designed to encourage the player to utilize the melee attacks and use them consistently in combat, because the game doesn't actually give the player enough ammo to actually make it through most combat scenarios. So you have to actually utilize the hand-to-hand combat. The melee attacks are fucking atrocious, and the game forces them on you without you really having any choice in the matter. To make things even worse, this is a co-op game. So you have a partner throughout the entire game in every single campaign, with the exception of Ada's. Ada's campaign is the only one where it's just her. It's just that character, and that's how it is from start to finish. In Leon's campaign, it's Leon and Helena together. In Chris's campaign, it's him and another character named Piers from start to finish. And then in Jake's campaign, it's him and Sherry together throughout that entire campaign. And it's just a fucking joke. The game legit is not scary. Now, it can be argued that none of the Resident Evil games are actually scary. I would agree to that argument to a certain extent. The Resident Evil games certainly have terrifying moments, even if they're not legit frightening from start to finish. But with Resident Evil 6, the horror element is just completely absent. And the reason is because you have a partner that's with you throughout the entire game. And Resident Evil 5 had the same issue. I think the only game in this series that attempted co-op and actually got it halfway decent is Resident Evil 0. And the only reason that really worked is because several points throughout that game's runtime, you had to split up Billy and Rebecca to go and accomplish different tasks in the levels where that game took place. So the co-op actually kind of worked to that game's benefit, somewhat. Whereas in Resident Evil 5 and 6, the co-op element really doesn't do these games any favors. Then Capcom decided that it would be a good idea to stuff this game with a bunch of QTEs. Quicktime events are something that has died out in video games over the last several years, and there's a big reason for that. Because whereas the intention originally with QTEs was to initiate moments in gameplay that the game developers really couldn't develop naturally within a specific combat system, instead they could piece together varying animations and have the characters in their games take actions that would otherwise be impossible. However, over time, QTEs have really devolved into something that's rather frustrating, because game developers were not able to find a balance with them for most titles. And what would really happen is they would develop QTEs to be inserted into an action set piece, and if the player presses the wrong button, then they receive an automatic game over. along with the cheap death that insults the player's intelligence because it only responds to their reaction time and nothing else. And Resident Evil 6 has some of the worst QTEs imaginable that I've seen in a video game. The QTEs in this game are way too numerous. They pop up at the most inconvenient of times, and if you press the wrong button, the game will unceremoniously hand you a game over, and there's really nothing that you can do about it. But what makes the QTEs especially terrible in this game is that they have QTEs for things that really don't even make any sense, like opening doors. This is how I knew that Resident Evil 6 was going to be a terrible experience the very first time I played this years ago. I knew this game was going to be terrible when they put a QTE in this game to open a fucking door. Like, realistically, there's only so much that I can tolerate. But then, it gets worse. Because the game is geared towards action gameplay, but is also trying to be a horror game at the same time, ammunition is really scarce in this game. Which is why the game emphasizes that the player utilizes the melee combat in order to get through the various combat scenarios that the game throws at you. But the lack of ammunition really clashes with the action theme that the game is going for. And so what you have is an identity crisis where the game doesn't really know what the hell it wants to be. At one moment, it wants to be a horror game. The next moment, it wants to be an action game. The moment after that, it wants to be a stealth game. By the way, the stealth in this fucking game is also shit. It's very poorly designed when you compare it to other stealth-based video games that do a much better job, whether it's Metal Gear Solid, or Sly Cooper, or Splinter Cell. Even the stealth in Final Fantasy 15 makes more sense than the bullshit that they have in this game. At least the stealth in that game was utilized to manipulate one of the game's primary gameplay mechanics, with the warp system. There is no special gameplay mechanic in Resident Evil 6 in regards to the stealth. And there's really no penalty for being caught either, which is kind of the whole point of a stealth game. There's supposed to be some kind of penalty for being seen. And once again, if you compare it to any other stealth game, the Batman Arkham series, Sly Cooper, Splinter Cell, Metal Gear Solid, etc., it's a joke by comparison. And really, that's the whole point of the different campaigns. Each campaign is supposed to represent a different gameplay style. For Leon's campaign, it's supposed to be more or less a straightforward survival horror experience, which is the reason Leon's campaign is actually the best that this game has to offer, because it's the one that's the most tolerable. Chris's campaign is the one that's geared towards action, and was made for fans of games like Call of Duty and Battlefield. It's the campaign where you're more free to waste ammo, by comparison to the other campaigns that are in the game. Jake's campaign is really meant to be for stealth fans, and here and there is also geared more towards survival horror. And Ada's campaign is kind of a mixture of the three. There's really no consistency between any of the campaigns, all the way down to the UI. There's different UI for every single campaign with the exception of Ada's, which shares the same UI as Jake's campaign. Why they decided to do this, I don't know. I haven't seen that in a video game that has multiple playable characters before Resident Evil 6 or since Resident Evil 6. It makes zero sense to have different UI for different characters in the same video game. There was really no purpose for that. And it's one of the baffling decisions that I'm surprised actually was greenlighted and made it past the cutting room floor. And speaking of the different campaigns, and also in regards to the narrative, the new characters that they have in this game are completely boring. This would include Jake, Derek Simmons, Helena, and Piers. All four of these characters provide absolutely nothing new to the Resident Evil series, and they're more or less stereotypes that actually do jack shit for the plot, that offer nothing but cheap soap opera style moments throughout the game's narrative. And just when you thought that the story couldn't get any worse, or the gameplay couldn't get any worse with the fucking QTEs, the blatant lack of ammunition throughout all four campaigns, the clash in gameplay styles, Capcom implemented a Gears of War Call of Duty style Last Stand system, where as soon as you run out of health, you're given a little bar on screen that slowly depletes, and your character becomes grounded, where you have the opportunity, somewhat, to defend yourself before being killed, and you have to rely on your partner to revive you. The problem with this is that the camera is so fucking awful, combined with the fact that they blur out the screens, making it extremely hard to see, and the aiming with this mechanic is somehow made worse given the limited perspective that the game forces on you, combined with the slow movement where you really can't get away from whatever threat is on screen. It's just another thing that makes this game extremely frustrating, along with other useless mechanics such as dodge rolling and jumping on the ground like a mentally ill schizophrenic who forgot to take their meds. Then you have the enemies in this game. The enemies in this fucking game are the worst that Capcom has ever developed for one of these Resident Evil games, mainly due to the fact that they're very cartoonish. All of the enemies have what's known as the C virus, in which they mutate into different forms. And the problem with this is that it makes the enemies extremely difficult to kill, which makes them not more challenging, but rather more frustrating. And this is a big reason why you're forced to use the melee mechanic, because it conserves ammunition. The mutations in this game are so fucking retarded that half the time I really don't know what the fuck I'm shooting at. The monster designs look absolutely ridiculous, and it really doesn't feel like a Resident Evil title whatsoever. And it doesn't help the fact that there's a real inconsistency with how smart the enemies actually are, in which they're capable of picking up varying weapons and using them against the player. So they're not even really zombies at that point. They're just normal people that have been injected with some stupid virus who are completely cognitive and aware of what they're doing at all times. And this is really lazy on the behalf of Capcom, because what it does is it regresses each combat encounter to play out virtually the same way, which usually plays out in the form of a shooting gallery, one that is neither fun nor interesting. To make the gameplay in Resident Evil 6 even worse, there's a severe lack of puzzles that are in the game. I believe there's only maybe 2 or 3 puzzles throughout the entire game that I can remember, and they're all extremely easy to figure out. The most difficult puzzle that's in this game comes from Ada's campaign, and that one is really poorly designed because it's not really clear exactly what you're supposed to do. But once you figure it out, the solution doesn't really make you feel any smarter or empowered, the same way the puzzles in the older games did. There's a complete lack of Metroidvania elements with this game, and this issue really began with Resident Evil 4, which took a far more linear and straightforward approach compared to the older games in the series. And this was carried over to Resident Evil 5 and 6, and was only brought back when Capcom made Resident Evil 7. The problem with the lack of Metroidvania elements is that the gameplay is too brain dead and predictable. The non-linear interconnected level design that made Resident Evil popular is completely missing in this game. There are no surprises in this game whatsoever in regards to progression. And this is an issue right down to how the player acquires new weapons, which is literally dropped right in front of your path. There's no effort required in order to get new weapons in this game. It's completely scripted as to when you acquire new weapons, but unlike the older games in the series, there's no effort on the behalf of the player to solve an interesting, unique puzzle in order to acquire weapons like the shotgun or the grenade launcher. And as far as subsequent playthroughs, once again, if you're batshit enough to replay this game, the unlockable weapons with the infinite ammunition does make a return in Resident Evil 6, but the whole system is ruined because they're tied to this skill system where you can only equip 3 skills at a time, and you have a long list of skills that you can level up. But the real problem with the skill system comes from the amount of time that the game expects you to invest in it in order to unlock the skills that you want to use in the game, which is tied to some kind of currency system based off of your performance throughout each individual level. The cost to unlock many of the skills that this game has is way too expensive and time-consuming to acquire. And the problem with that is Resident Evil 6 is not a fun game. It's not a fun game to play at all, and it's not remotely worth it to waste your time to unlock really any of the infinite weapons. Speaking of which, I did notice that there's a complete lack of an infinite rocket launcher in this game. Now, the infinite rocket launcher, which was a staple in some of the earlier Resident Evil games, also didn't make a return in Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village. The reason it's not a problem in Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village is because Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village are actually good games, and this game is not. Beyond the shit gameplay, the boring new characters, the terrible progression system, the annoying skill system, among a myriad of other issues. The inventory system doesn't even make any sense in this game. Each character essentially has two different inventory slots. You have your inventory for weapons, and then you have an inventory for your just general items that you use. But instead of separating these things in one consistent menu, everything is separated on this dial track, is the best way I can describe it. And you're forced to shift through this terrible UI track when you're managing your items, even in the heat of combat, which could be the difference between life and death in this game. Instead of making the inventory selection just over convoluted and complicated, they should have kept it simplified. Why they didn't, once again, I don't know. With regards to extra content that they put in this game, most of it comes in the form of extra multiplayer modes that they initially forced people to pay for. And multiplayer has never been the strong point of the Resident Evil series. If anything, multiplayer has been the bane of the series for a long time. And it's no different in Resident Evil 6. The misguided focus on multiplayer is one of the reasons Resident Evil 6 just does not work on any given level. As far as this retrospective goes, I didn't really play any of the multiplayer modes in this game, simply because I was not interested. And I would have had to pay even more money to unlock the modes that I didn't already have, and there was no way I was going to do that. Now, I played this on PC, and the PC port of this game is just, what the fuck? I had issue after issue after issue trying to get this game to run consistently on PC, and it's completely random when the game actually wants to fucking work and when it doesn't. I had issues trying to get the game to load full screen, and basically it worked when it wanted to work, and when it didn't work, which was often, it was the most frustrating experience imaginable. I even had to go on a YouTube video and download a file in the video description just to have controller support, so I wouldn't be stuck with the keyboard and mouse. Because even though I game on PC, I can't stand using keyboard and mouse, especially considering that I'm on a laptop and not a desktop. I prefer to play video games with a controller. So why this game doesn't have a consistent controller support is beyond me. Oh, and Mercenaries Mode does return in this game, but it's also shit. The reason Mercenaries Mode isn't anywhere near as engaging as it should be is really because the time checkpoints are too far apart, and the stages are just too big. On PC, it's made even worse because, unlike the console version of Resident Evil 6, Mercenaries Mode with the PC version, the player does not have access to all the stages and characters in the PC version right from the start. You have to unlock stages and new characters with Mercenaries Mode in the PC version by obtaining these ridiculous high scores. And the mode is not anywhere near as fun or engaging enough to waste time trying to progress through Mercenaries Mode in this game. So, all in all, Resident Evil 6 is a piece of fucking dog shit. It's an irredeemable piece of dog shit. This game damn near almost killed this franchise, and it really serves as the black sheep of the Resident Evil series, and also serves as a perfect example of what not to do when you have a long-running franchise like this. Capcom didn't stick to the basics of what made Resident Evil great. Instead, they went out of their way to try and attract a new audience, instead of giving their core fans what they want, and that was a severe mistake. Fortunately, they got their head out of their ass with Resident Evil 7, and they've really been on an upwards trajectory since the release of Resident Evil 6. But looking back at where they were back in 2012, yeah, a lot of people were not happy with Capcom back then, and it's very easy to see why. Now finally I can delete this game on my Steam and forget that it even exists. I do not intend to play this game ever again, and I only replayed it to do this retrospective. So for those watching, I hope you enjoyed it, because I certainly didn't.
Sure. My schedule just cleared.
Легко помереть не получится, Алонсо.